U.S. President Joe Biden met with Turkey's president on the sidelines of a G20 summit on Indonesia's Bali island earlier today. Agenda items for the NATO members could include extending a deal allowing Ukrainian grain exports to continue, NATO enlargement, and the weekend Istanbul bomb attack that is being blamed on Kurdish militants. President Biden oversees this morning for the G20 summit. News 4 White House correspondent Jon Decker is traveling with the president. He joins us now live with the very latest. Before we get started, Jon, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks a lot, Kinsley. Thanks for having me on this morning. I appreciate it.
Always glad to have you join us, Jon. So tell us, this is the G20's first meeting since Russia invaded Ukraine. Do you expect any group action against the Kremlin?
I do. The majority of G20 countries have condemned this illegal invasion by Russia into the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Of course, Russia is a member of the G20, so do not expect a joint statement coming out from the G20. But once again, the majority of countries will be focused on that. Having said all of that, it's important to remember that President Putin is not here. Instead, he sent his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, to represent Russia and its efforts as it relates to the G20 summit, and that's the reason why Russia is essentially the skunk at the garden party, so to speak, because of the fact of Russia's invasion of the sovereign territory of Ukraine.
So, Jon, tell us, with all the opposition to Russia's war against Ukraine, will there be a family photo this year?
Not this year. That tradition's going away. It's not happening this year, and the reason being is because of Sergei Lavrov, and no one wants to be seen standing next to him during that tradition of the world leaders gathered here at the G20 summit taking that family photo. So that's going away this year, and clearly what has happened over the last few months has really impacted the way the G20 views Russia as a member. There were even efforts to kick Russia out of the G20. That has not come to pass. Russia was invited here by the host country of the G20 summit this year. That's Indonesia, and that's the reason why Russia is indeed here during this particular summit.
So, Jon, let's talk more about the G20 summit. What is the focus of this year's summit? Can you tell us?
Yeah, there's a few things. First of all, this is the first year since the pandemic, so every country around the world, including the U.S., recovering from the G20 summit. And so that is certainly one focus of what is going to take place during this three-day summit. In addition to that, you're going to have efforts focused on Ukraine and making certain that the unity that we've seen in place since February the 24th, remains in place. It's going to be a difficult winter in Ukraine. There are exceedingly high oil and gas prices in Europe, and that's the reason why it's difficult to maintain that unity with what all of the other countries that are members of the G20 are going through right now. One final thing that will certainly be on the agenda, that's climate. This is a priority for President Biden, and indeed, lowering the carbon footprint of the leading economies in the world is a major focus, a major priority for other leaders that are meeting here in Indonesia.
So President Biden gave a press conference in Bali and spoke on the midterms and abortion rights. Tell us, what did he have to say during that?
Well, what President Biden said was it was pretty evident to him that Republicans would likely have a small majority in the House of Representatives. And as a result, it's very unlikely, he said, unless something really unusual happens, that there would be an effort to codify Roe versus Wade into federal law. And so what the president is focused on is trying to make certain that the administration protects reproductive rights in the way that it can. And we've seen these efforts as it relates to executive action, but it's pretty clear that it's not going to move forward in the House of Representatives, even with a small majority that Republicans will have in the next legislative session.
So what can you tell us about any upcoming meetings on President Biden's schedule?
Yeah, the president met today already with President Erdogan of Turkey. He, of course, represents a very important country in the G20, a member of NATO, a member of the EU, and he's played a very important part in making certain that grain gets out of Ukraine and provides that important food supply all around the world. Also meeting today with his counterpart from Italy, the new Prime Minister from Italy, Prime Minister Meloni. Tomorrow on the agenda, the president will meet with his counterpart from the UK. All of these conversations are important, but especially in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that is the primary topic that the president has had. We've seen the readout from his conversation that he had with President Erdogan. That was a big focus of that conversation.
All right, John, one last question before we go. The president has a busy schedule ahead. He met with Chinese President Xi face-to-face for the first time since becoming president. Is the White House pleased with the outcome, and do we know how China feels about the sit-down?
Yeah, both countries very pleased with the way that the conversation went. Remember, it's 3.5 hours that President Biden met with President Xi. The White House said do not expect any major breakthroughs, and there were none, but communication's important, and those lines of communication reestablished after the relationship between the U.S. and China really in a bad place. China, for its part, released a statement in which it called the talks productive and very candid. These are good things, and it moves that relationship forward. I think that the big issue that was on the agenda during this conversation was Taiwan, and to a large extent they agreed to disagree on that particular issue. But President Biden, again, making it clear that the U.S. policy towards Taiwan has not changed. The one China policy remains the policy of the United States, and that policy has remained in place for decades with both Republican and Democratic presidents.
All right, John, unfortunately, that's our time. But again, thank you so much for joining us this morning.